So much, and be seated, please.
If you have your Bible tonight, we'll do a little Bible study here in Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, while you're turning there, we have a former member from years ago, Kim Roos, is visiting with us. And Kim, it's so good to see you tonight. Stand up. We welcome you here, and it's great to have you back with us after a long, long time. God bless you, brother. And it's pretty good to see Clayton B. Simmons back there. Clayton, we welcome you. Good to have you back with us. And I'll help him out. He is safe. Okay, he is safe. Philippians chapter 4 and verse number 10. Philippians 4:10. You want to stand with me, please, and we'll read God's word. Philippians 4 and 10. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I've learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Somebody wrote and said that Paul, we know, was not from Texas. Or he never could have said, in whatever state I am, I'll be content. Because Texans are never content except where? In Texas. Yeah, I've been married to one for 52 years, and she said tonight, I really like to cook chicken fried steak. It reminds me of Texas. I like chicken fried steak because it's good. She likes it because it reminds her of Texas. Isn't that wild? So, where was I now? Profound scriptural teaching there. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I've learned in whatever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I'm instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Thank you, and you may be seated. The book of Philippians is one of 4 books in the New Testament that was written from a prison cell. We call them the prison epistles, the prison letters. And that's Philippians along with Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon would be the other 3. The book of Philippians has been called a thank you note from the Apostle Paul to the church at Philippi. We get those a lot. We do something for a missionary or somebody, a member of the congregation, and they'll write us back and they'll say thank you to the church. And we usually put a little blurb that says thank you in the church program or the bulletin or something. The whole book of Philippians is really a thank you note to the entire church there at Philippi. Now, Paul thanks them because they have sent him a gift, a monetary gift. They've sent him money. And in verse 10, he refers to it, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again. Your care of me refers to a gift, a financial gift. They had raised money and they'd sent it to the Apostle Paul. And he says it has flourished again. The reason he says that is because they had sent Paul a gift about 10 years before. If you go down to verse 15, now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, he means in the beginning of my gospel ministry. When I first started in the ministry, when I departed from Macedonia, a province of Greece, and where Philippi was located, no church communicated or gave anything, supported with me as concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent once and then again unto my necessity. So 10 years before, the church at at Philippi, the Philippians had sent Paul a financial gift, and then he hadn't heard from him for 10 years. The reason he hadn't is he had been off of their radar. They had heard from him, and then Paul had gone on all these missionary journeys, and apparently they had lost contact with him. And then they found out that he had been jailed in Rome, and so they raised the money, and they sent him a very good financial gift. So Paul acknowledges that gift more than once here. In fact, he's just always talking about being thankful to them. In the first part of the book here, chapter 1, verse 3, for example, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. And throughout the book, there's these thank yous sprinkled in. Paul really loves and appreciates the church at Philippi. And in this book, he doesn't correct doctrine, and he doesn't try to teach them. He really is just encouraging them. It's probably the most encouraging book in the New Testament. Now, the key word as you read the book of Philippians, if you'll read it all, and you could read it all in probably 15, 20 minutes at the most. If you read through the book of Philippians and you would mark every time it says rejoice, or you would mark with a pen or something every time it says joy. It's the epistle of joy. It's the epistle of rejoicing. So sometimes we need to hear that, don't we? How many of you feel like you just got the upper hand? You've just got everything in control in life? Well, I was going to say, if you did, enjoy it for the next 10 minutes. And I promise you it's going to change after that, isn't it? It doesn't last long, those brief moments when we feel like everything is under our control. And so Paul here is addressing that kind of subject. And he gives a lot of practical advice in this book. This is a book of practical advice on how to respond to problems. Now, I'm going to give you 3 little simple points here this evening if you want to mark them in your Bible. First of all, I want you to notice the providence of God. The providence of God. And that's verse 10. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. Now in the last few days, your care of me hath flourished again. What he is saying basically is that God in his providence has looked out for me, and he's used you people to do it. And your care has flourished in my life again. The word providence, boy, the old preachers, the old Christians, the old commentaries and so on, they use that word all the time. And you don't hear people talking about it much today. It is a great, great concept, the providence of God. What is the providence of God? Take the word providence, look at that word, and then break it down. That's the way to understand many of the words. And the first part of it is pro, and pro means before. It's a English word that has the idea of before. And then if you look at the V-I-D-E-N-C-E part of it, that comes from the Latin vide, V-I-D-E, which means to see. So providence means to see before, or to see beforehand. We get our word video from the vide, the Latin vide, video. See, you see it right there. So to see something getting ready to happen before it happens, that's the providence of God. And we know that God knows the end from the beginning. We know that God knows the past, the present, and the future. And so God is a providential God. He sees what we need even before we know that we need it. How often have I seen that? It is God seen before. Sometimes we use it to talk about his protection. George Washington talked about the providence of God. And he talked about how that in the Battle of Monongahela, before the country was even formed, when he was a general in the British Army, even when he was in the British Army before he was before we had America, of course. I say he was a general. I think he was a colonel. And he led the troops, the British troops, in a battle up at where West Virginia is now, in the Monongahela Valley, against in an Indian war, really is what it was. And the Indians were trying to kill him. And they shot out from under him 2 or 3 horses. When he got back after the battle, he had not only lost his horse 2 or 3 times, and somebody had loaned him another one, but he took his coat off, and there were bullet holes running through his coat. And it's a wonderful story. And he attributes it to the providence of God, that God saw beforehand, and God directed and determined, and God protected him. The providence of God. God sees before. I've seen it so many times here. God sees before, and he works in advance to arrange the circumstances and situations to carry out his purpose. Let me give you that definition again. That's a definition. Providence is God working in advance to arrange circumstances and situations that will fulfill his purpose. We bought this property. We moved down here. But we began to have real problems because we only have one outlet onto the street. And you know, when we have normal times and we have big crowds, it takes a long time to get off the property now with 1, 2, 3, 4 different exits. Well, then we have one. We have one driveway, this one over here. And then we heard they were building the bypass back here. And they put a note in the paper and said, if you want to come and appeal for a cut meaning a break where you could put a road, an access road onto the bypass back here. If you want to come to the state hearing and appeal for a cut, then you come to the hearing. And so I didn't go. A couple of our men went. And they went to the hearing. And after they got there, they were talking about where they were going to open up a cut to get on ingress and egress off of the interstate. And they said, now there's going to be one right here. And it's where that one is, where Frank Monroe runs right out there into the bypass. And then they said, now we've had 1 or 2 down here. There won't be any more north of here. That's the only one we're going to have. And we have been having deacons meetings and talking about how could we alleviate our delay in our parking. And we went, and the cut had already been approved by the engineers 2 or 3 years before. And there it was. All we had to do is build the road to connect into it. Isn't that something? Now, you think that's just circumstantial? If you want to think that, think it. I think it's providential. Pro-video. God was seeing before we even knew about it, and he arranged the circumstances because he knew that one day we were going to need a cut to get on and off of our property. Now, Paul was in jail when this is written. Remember that. He's in a Roman jail. He was released after this for 2 years, and then they put him back in jail and executed him. But he's in jail when he writes these words. But he says, God's still looking out for me. And I needed some money. And you hadn't communicated with me in 10 years. But you know what? God took care of my need. The Lord put it in your hearts that you would give, and now you've met my need. And I thank God upon every remembrance of you, chapter 1 and verse number 3 and 4. God put it in the heart of the Philippian Christians to be concerned about him. By the way, do you ever look at a Christian in the church and be concerned about them and the Lord impress on your heart, maybe I ought to help them a little bit? We've got some poor people that come to church. And we have people every now and then that lose their job. And we try to help people, and we do help a lot of people. We help a lot of people. But you know what? It's one thing for the church to give them a church check. It's something else for somebody to come up and say, brother, here's a $20 bill. I know you're out of work and I want to help. You see the difference? One-on-one, personal love that we would show to people. And when God raises up an impulse, a desire in your heart to do something for somebody, or help a ministry, or it may be another kind of help, then that's the Lord speaking to you. And it might be Him providentially seeing before the need of somebody else and asking you to meet that need. So that was exactly what was happening with Paul. Now look down at verse 11. He said, not that I speak in respect of one. I'm really not doing without, but it means a lot to me that you have given. It will help me. For I have learned. Well, that gets my attention. If Paul says he's learned something, I want to know this is a great Paul. The man chosen to write 13 books of the New Testament. There's nobody greater probably in Christian history. He says, I've learned something, so that makes my antenna go up. What have you learned, Paul? I have learned in whatsoever state I am to be content. Whoa. Have you learned to be content? That's a challenge, isn't it? Paul said, I've learned. Now, the word learned there, when I looked it up and did a little word study on it, it has the idea I've learned by experience. It's not I've learned in a classroom when I heard somebody say something. I have learned through life experience. I have experienced life, and from that I have learned to be content. He had learned that God was sufficient for him, regardless of his circumstances. Now, look at what he has learned. And we begin in verse number 12. And let's see, there are about 8 or 9 things here. First of all, he says, well, back up in verse 11, I have learned to be content. That'd be the first one. I'm going to give you a list now if you want to write them down. What did Paul learn? I've learned to be content. You know what content means. It means to be satisfied. It means to be fulfilled. It means to be at peace, to be contented. Now, you young people don't know anything about this because you didn't live in the golden days. But I remember when on every Borden milk can it said, from contented cows. How many of y'all remember that? You remember Borden's milk from contented cows? I guess the milk from a cow that's contented is better than the milk from a cow that's in chaos. But at any rate, from contented cows. Well, this is from a contented apostle. He said, I have learned, one, to be abased. What does that mean? It means to live humbly. To not have everything I want materially, but to live on the bottom maybe for a while materially. And then he said, I have learned how to abound. And that's the opposite. That's to live in prosperity. That's to really be blessed of the Lord, to have everything that you need. I have learned, he said, everywhere to be content. So in all places that I am. And in all things. That would be all situations, all circumstances. And he said, I have learned how to be full. And that is talking about being full, your stomach, to have enough to eat. And I've learned to be hungry. I've learned both to abound, and I've learned how to suffer need. I've learned how to live when I had everything in the world I could want, and then I've learned how to live when I didn't have anything I was in need. The word content used here is a really interesting word. It means to be self-contained. What it means, it doesn't mean to be selfish, Obviously, it doesn't mean that. But it means to not depend upon other people for your sense of well-being and peace. You stop and think about it. How many people do you know, and how many times maybe even in your own life have our contentment was based on somebody else? Well, boy, I'm going to tell you what, that won't last. I don't care who they are, how good they are. Our contentment sometimes has been based upon, well, if I had something that I dream about. So some people say, my contentment is based upon a relationship. If I could just marry that man or that woman, if I could just get the teenagers, if I could just get that guy or gal to pay some attention to me, I would be content. No, you wouldn't. And then sometimes we base it upon things. If I just had that new car, if I just had that position, that job, if I just had that dream home that we've been talking about, I'd be content. I'm going to tell you, I don't think you would. You see, the things of time will not satisfy a heart that God made for eternity. The things of time will not satisfy a heart that God made for eternity. And we fill it up with the junk of this world, the material, the temporal, the temporary. And we expect it to give us satisfaction and contentment. And not very many people are content today. If you could read the prescriptions at the local pharmacy of how many people can't stand to live without chemical help. Contentment is a rare, rare virtue. I want you to notice something else about contentment that Paul says. He said, I have learned to be contented. Contentment is a learned virtue. It's something that we're not born with it and we don't get it in a package one day. Contentment is, I learned to be contented. I learn a little bit, and I learn a little bit more, and a little bit more. I learn to be contented. So contentment doesn't come from my position or somebody's sick and they say, I would be contented if I could just have my health back. I don't think so. I think what Paul was saying is, I have to be contented if my health fails. I have to be contented if I don't have the position or the dream home or the job or my needs even. That there is a way to live a meaningful, full life, and it's above all this stuff that we Americans have said you have to be contented and to be happy. When I've traveled different places in the world and met with God's people, believers in Christ, you know what, I think every time I've come home from a trip, I've said it to you. I've noticed the joy that people have that don't have anything else. If you go down to some of these impoverished third world countries, the only thing they have is joy. They live in a hut. They don't have good food. They don't have good health care. They don't have good clothes. They don't have good anything. They don't have a retirement plan. They don't have a nice home. They got nothing. They live in a little hovel somewhere, and yet they'll come to the Lord's house, and the one thing that overwhelms you is the joy of the Lord on their faces. And you come back to America, and my goodness, morning service looks like a funeral in comparison. They've got a source of joy that bubbles up from down inside them. It's like a fountain. And they're not dependent on somebody's approval or their circumstances or their bank account. They have the joy of the Lord. They have contentment. Paul, I tell you, he didn't have contentment because he had it easy. Flip back a few pages to 2 Corinthians 11. And you just ask yourself, now if I'd experienced what Paul had experienced, would I be writing to somebody from a jail cell how contented I am? That's a stretch, I'll tell you. He's in jail writing to people about how contented he is, and here's what he's just been through. 2 Corinthians 11 and 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. Well, I'm more of a minister than they are, is what he's saying. I've done more ministry than these other people he's comparing himself to. In labors, I've worked harder, more abundant. In stripes above measure, that's beatings. I have been beaten above measure. The Jews would only let you be beaten 39 times, but the Romans didn't quit at 39. I've been beat above measure. In prisons, I've been more frequently jailed than the other people. In deaths, oft. Most people can't say I've died, but Paul did. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 39 stripes, 40 stripes save one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned at Lystra. 3 times I was in shipwrecks. A night and a day I have been bobbing out there in the sea. In journeyings I've spent my life traveling. In perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, when I was weary and in pain, and I was watching often in hunger and thirst, meaning I couldn't sleep. I was up all night because I was so hungry and thirsty, in fastings often, in cold, and in nakedness, and beside these things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. And he's been through all that. He's sitting in a jail cell. And what does he say? I've learned to be content. I can listen to a man like that, can't you? Wow, that to me is so very, very powerful. You know what Paul could have said? He could have said, my life has been an absolute disaster. It's one problem after another, after another, after another, after another. And now I'm in jail. But I'm content. That's convicting, isn't it? That's really convicting. In America, if the dinner's 15 minutes late, we're complaining. And what a man, what a man. Now, the last thing he says here, verse 13. This is a great verse, isn't it? Everybody knows this verse, and what a great one it is. I can do all things through Christ